Hey, welcome to Q&A, where you ask your questions and I do my best to provide a thoughtful, certainly I hope a biblical answer to it. So today's question is a very pastoral question. There's a lot of, I sense, frustration in this question. And so as I read it, maybe you might be able to relate to this. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how to deal with toxic, negative people. It seems they're everywhere and I find them so tiring. I just want to avoid them. And you're right. It does seem that there are more and more toxic, negative people around. And I think, to be fair, it's a reflection of the times in which we live. I think, the times in which we live are very divisive. They're very negative times, and that spills over into people. Because we live in that environment without even becoming aware of it. It's shaping so many people's heart. And they are living out of that. And so in some ways, it shouldn't surprise us that there is an increase. But you're right. It is tiring. And I get the temptation to avoid them. So let me offer you some thoughts on how to deal with these people, because at the end of the day, if we're not careful, what happens is this. The temptation is to jump right in and try and change them, to get them to realize that how destructive, how unhelpful, how negative that they are, and how they are pushing people away, and how they're not fun to be around, and they've got to change, and all these sorts of things. And when we do that, and I understand why we do it, and we do want people to change, but when we jump straight into that point, my observation is this, that what ends up happening is that instead of having a conversation, we end up having a confrontation. And I think of what Paul says in Ephesians 4:26, in our anger, do not sin. In other words, when you enter into relationships and it becomes confrontational, we get angry, and the temptation is to sin. And Paul's advice is recognize that dynamic and therefore avoid it. He doesn't say never get angry, but recognize that there are times when this anger is not helpful, it's not constructive, and it's going to lead us to temptation. It's going to lead us to sin. And I think this is one of those situations where this happens, because when we jumped in to try and change people, what happens is we come and say, look, I've had enough. Do you realize, and we have that conversation, their first response is generally to push back, and there's a denial, and they project it onto us, and it's we who have the problem and everything else. And that's where the anger comes from. And it happens because here's what's happening in that exchange. Whether you are aware of it or not, there's this dynamic I've observed where, how would I describe it? It's like flesh hooks flesh. The carnal hooks the carnal. The worldly hooks the worldly. So what happens is their negativity, their pettiness, their brokenness, their frustrations, their toxicity begins to hook into us and bring us down to their level, because instead of reacting or responding out of faith, out of grace, out of a genuine desire to help someone, we get drawn into that fleshly dynamic, which is not honoring of God in any shape or form, and we get drawn into it, and that's why we end up in confrontation. That's why you find it tiring, and it's why you want to avoid them, and that's why I say I advise not just jumping in and around these people trying to correct them. I know we want to, and I know the temptation, and I know why, but don't, because I don't think it's helpful. I think of what Jesus says in Matthew 7, where he talks about, before you try and address the speck in someone else's eye, look at the log in your own. In other words, yes, these people may be toxic. Yes, they are negative. But before you jump in and try and get them to recognize that, take a step back and look at yourself. What's going on in your life? Where can their negativity, their pettiness, their bitterness, their frustration draw you into that, into acting like that? Where can their carnality hook into yours? And so begin to deal with that first. You can't change them. but you can change yourself. Recognize that the moment you have that conversation, until they recognize it, the dynamic in play is whatever is causing that toxicity, that frustration, that negativity is going to try and hook into you and bring you down into that level, because that's the dynamic in play. So my advice is, in the light of that, don't let their stuff trap you. Don't let their stuff draw you into responding that way. If you feel it is going to, just walk away. Don't have that conversation. Recognize that it's going to push buttons. I know that there are certain things in my life below the surface. When certain people say certain things, I can feel something rising up. And how I respond to that is entirely up to me. I can't blame anybody else. I'm in control of what I do with that emotion. And there are some things that at times where it's just below the surface, and I know that, so I'm not going to have certain conversations with people, because it's not going to be constructive for either of us. And I'm not going to let them bring me down. So I'm not going to let their sin become my sin. I'm not going to let them cause me to be less than who I'm trying to be in God. The other thing I would encourage you to do around these sorts of people is to create emotional distance. As I say, you're not responsible for how they act out. You're responsible for your response. And so create emotional distance so that it doesn't, the effect on you is less. It just doesn't wind you up. You recognize, hey, it reflects on them, not you. And if that means having physical distance, have physical distance. You're not wanting to let them corrupt the wellspring of your life, to pollute the wellspring of what God's created in you with their negativity, with their toxicity. Hanging around with toxic people does that. That's why I think if you're in a workplace which is toxic, you got to surround yourself with people who are emotionally stable, who are going to build you up, who are going to fill you with not simply positivity, but the positivity of God, the things of Christ that are going to bring joy, that are going to bring hope, that are going to bring peace, that are going to bring all of those sorts of things into your life, so that you're not overwhelmed by that environment. And as I say, just recognize that sometimes that you do have to create that distance, that physical distance, because you can't control them. You can only control yourself. And if you feel vulnerable, if you feel overwhelmed, if you feel tired, that's when you're most likely to respond out of negativity. You're going to let their frustrations, their toxicity is going to hook into something in you. Because you're tired, you'll drop your guard and you're going to respond in less godly ways than you want. So recognize that and just walk away. But Jesus says sometimes you got to recognize to engage with them is like casting pearls before swine. They're not going to honor it. They're just going to trample it. Don't even go there. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but those are my thoughts. So, love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Hey, as always, you can ask your questions at slido.com. Use the hashtag ALC22. Well, that's it for this time. Until next time, God bless.